a disclaimer, so yeah. Let me get back to that. So fill out our attendance so that later on you can vote on our elections. What is ACM at UC? This meeting, or if it's not, you already know, but we're the Association for Computing Machinery at UC. Computer science and programming is what we do, so anything tech, we love it. A group of students built around a common interest in computers, tech, and software. We have our Slack and Discord, and we host talks like this one, workshops, hackathons, RevUC, and we love all majors, especially our tech ones. Code of conduct. Just to clarify, we do look at the chat, and we want this to be a safe space for everyone, so don't harass people on our Discord, Slack, or in the chat. Be cool. No feigning surprise. No, well, actually, no backseat driving. Focus on learning. Basically, don't try to show off the fact that you know a lot of things, but don't also, we just like to learn here. Events. We have a social coming up next week. We should have a poll in hashtag general channel. So vote on that, and the day we'll figure that out too, so that we can try to get to know each other in this sad and lonely world. Our next meeting will be November 12th on Thursdays, as always, at 7 p.m. And we're going to be going over full stack development with Daniel Loescher. So that'll be super interesting. Office hours, come on in and come talk to us. It's Tuesdays at noon and Thursdays at 8, so right after this meeting, we have our office hours. And it's on Discord, so links are somewhere in this slide. We've been starting a new thing where we do raffles, because usually if we meet in person, we have pizza, but fortunately, virtual meetings means we can't really send you guys all pizza at the same time. So check out our raffle at the end of the meeting, and you have to do this to make sure to sign into like the attendance thing. I say that a lot because that's how we know if you're here. Just a little shout out to Revolution UC, which is the hackathon that ACM at UC hosts. It's coming this spring. We're still in the planning process, but check out our Instagram and Twitter for updates, as well as our date reveal, which will be happening soon. Slack is the best way to connect with other ACM members. We have all of our professional and just like networking things in there. You should already know, but we have all the channels for everything you need, and Slack is available on your app or on the desktop. So, and very important, but code of conduct still applies. And then our Discord. So this is for all the fun stuff. We have our office hours on here too, which is technically a fun thing, right? We have games. We'll have our social event on here probably if it's some sort of thing. So please join. So I'm introducing Baru for intro to technical interview. Baru, if you want to introduce yourself and then get going, go ahead. Baru, I don't think I hear you.
How about now?
There we go. Awesome.
Cool. So I'll get into the introduction in a bit, but I wanted to share my screen. Can you guys let me know if this is working? You guys can see this? Okay, awesome. So, hey everyone, my name is Baru, and this is my introduction to the technical interview. So before we begin, I just wanted to say I'm looking forward to answering all your guys' questions, but if you have a question, I suggest you use the raise hand feature in Teams, or you just put it in chat, and I'll do my best to answer it. But if you want to ask verbally or save it till the end, there'll also be a period at the end where I'll open up for questions. But with that out of the way, I have a question for you. Do you want to work at Google? Well, this is what I was asking myself about a year ago, and I was like, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. So I looked it up, and this is what they have on their website, right? You just apply to Google, you do the interview, and you decide if you want to work at Google, piece of cake. Well, it's a little misleading. Turns out it's a little more difficult than that. Well, according to an article from CNBC in 2019, Google gets 3 million applicants a year, and they have an acceptance rate of 0.2%. So not so simple. Doing a little more research, not fully verified, but according to a former Google intern on Quora, there were 40,000 applicants in the year of 2014, and 2,000 people accepted offers. So it's really difficult, but people have found a way. And these companies, they don't interview quite like what you might expect. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about what these technical interviews are like. And today, this is kind of a rundown of what we're going to be talking about. So the first thing will be a general what you need to know, and then I'll give a kind of story as to how I prepared. I'll do a kind of miscellaneous frequently asked questions section, and then finally end with a short demo where I'll be solving a real question and explaining how it works, and then I'll open up for questions. So a little bit about me before we get into the thick of things. My name is Baru Yogesh. I'm a third-year CS student here at U of Cincinnati. I'm the webmaster over at Techno Mentorship Establishment. We do a lot of entrepreneurship things. You should come check us out if you haven't already. And recently, I got 2 offers. I got an offer to JP Morgan Chase for the summer 2021 in Columbus, Ohio, as well as General Motors for the summer 2021 up in Detroit. And I've solved almost 230 questions on LeetCode.com. And if you don't have any context, that's more than what most people would solve, but it's not like a crazy high amount. Definitely not the peak, but I'd say I'm pretty well versed. So the first thing is what you need to know. This is kind of like what the interview is like, what the hiring process is like at these companies, because it's really different to what you might already be accustomed to. I've already done a co-op or two, but the interview process is just a whole nother world. So I want to talk about that before getting into more deeper detail. So the first thing is the process. So these companies are getting through a lot more people, so they have a lot more steps in the process. The first thing, I mean, this isn't like a hard and fast, every company does the same thing, but this is generally more or less what you might see at one of these companies is hiring process. So the first thing is the online assessment. So this isn't a real interview per se, but a company might either send a OA to all of their applicants, or they might review your resume and then go through the OA. And usually you'll get between 1 to 2 hours to solve some questions. And then the recruiter phone, this is usually more behavioral or informational, where the recruiter might just give you info on the process, or they'll ask you some behavioral questions. And then from there, you'll have a technical phone, where this is a real, the first kind of technical interview you might have at a company, where you'll sit down with an engineer over like a WebEx or a Zoom call, and you'll be solving a question. And then the on-site final round is not just one interview, but usually several interviews between 2 to 4, or sometimes more than that. And the companies will have a mix of behavioral and technical for the on-site. And it's called an on-site because usually the company flies you out to their headquarters, but everything is remote these days, unfortunately. So the questions, what do they look like? When people think of technical questions, traditionally, it's things like object-oriented programming design. It's like, oh, what's the difference between a class and a struct? But the technical questions that these companies ask are more based around algorithm design. And these questions are, you're given a problem and you have to write code that solves that problem. And I want to go through a quick example problem, just something you might expect, but it's a very common problem, so probably not at the same rate. So if you're given an array of integers and a target value, you need to identify if there's a combination within the array of 2 numbers such that when you sum them together, you can reach the target. So for this example at the bottom, there's an array of some numbers, and if you sum the 2 and the 9 together, you get 11. This question is called 2sum on LeetCode if you want to see it for yourself. But another important thing is algorithm efficiency. I mean, I'm assuming everyone here has a little background in coding, and they understand that there's often multiple ways to reach the same solution, but you'll come to know that there's different kinds of efficiencies for those solutions. So that's part of what I'll be talking about today, a little bit later. So the online assessment, what does that look like? Well, there's a plethora of different platforms, but I would say the most common platform is HackerRank. And usually, like I said earlier, you won't be talking to another person, but it's no human contact, and you're usually given 1 to 2 hours to solve some algorithm questions, and maybe you'll hear back after the fact. So then the typical technical interview, what does that look like? So usually you're blocked off like for an hour of time for the interview, but the actual problem solving portion is 45 minutes. And in that little space between, you'll be asked maybe, a little tell me about yourself, or they'll ask about a point on your resume, but nothing too in depth on that detail. And then they might do like a debriefing, do you have any questions, kind of that. So that'll be what you might expect. And usually you get 2 different questions. Not every company does the same way, but usually you get 2 different questions. Sometimes you get one question that builds into the other, but typically it's two separate questions, two separate things entirely. A big misconception about these interviews is that you're taking a test. When you're taking a test in school, you just don't talk and you focus on the question. The interview is not like that. It's not supposed to be like that, at least. I hope it's not like that for you, because you're supposed to be doing is you're supposed to be going back and forth, having a conversation and a discussion with your interviewer. The goal of the interviewer for the company is to identify what is your thought process, how does this person solve problems, and how do they, write the code out and deliver that solution. So they want to know what's going on in your head. A good rule of thumb is that you should try to avoid silence. I mean, it's okay to be silent for a bit, but try to avoid silence, but then also try to make sure that at any point in time, the interviewer knows exactly what's going on in your head. So for these phone interviews where you're doing it remotely with another engineer, you're using an online editor. I keep calling it a phone interview. That's what it's always been called. But again, you're probably going to be using something like WebEx or Zoom, and then you're going to be using like an online editor like CoderPad, for example, to be doing this interview. And it's like a collaborative, synchronized environment for coding. And then the in-person interviews, you might be going through a laptop or something like that, but for the majority of the time, you'll be actually writing your answers out with a marker on a whiteboard. And this throws people off of guard. A lot of people have never done this before, where you're writing code on a whiteboard. So that's something you should expect when you ever have an on-site interview, if coronavirus ever decides to be over. But the next thing is what companies ask LeetCode. And as I mentioned earlier, not every company, I mean, some of us here at UC already have co-op experience and they've never had to be asked all sorts of these kinds of questions. So what companies are asking LeetCode? Well, the first class of companies is FANG. And I would say Google is the one that pioneered this idea of the interview. But FANG stands for Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. And then alternatively, there's Big N. And Big N is the same idea. But some people, they will argue, oh, Netflix shouldn't be allowed. Maybe we should include Microsoft in there. No one comes to a consensus. So they just call it Big N companies. So for these startups, there's two kinds of startups. There's the unicorns, and this is a financial term. And it means that it's a company that is privately traded and it's worth more than $1 billion and it's a startup. So this is a company like Stripe or Airbnb, for example. And then there's other startups like Uber, Lyft that are publicly traded. They're asking lots of these kinds of questions as well. For the banks, these are not as common at banks, but still existent. These are things like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Capital One, Amex, things like that, like big banks, not small ones really. And then there's the quantitative finance sector. And if you're not familiar with these companies, they're not very big companies, but they do ask these kinds of questions and they're very competitive. And there are companies like Two Sigma, Jane Street, Hudson River Trading. There's a lot of those. There's like probably 20 or 30 different kinds of those companies. And if you haven't seen these kinds of questions before, it makes kind of sense. Basically, in the tech hubs of the US is where most of these competitive companies reside. These are areas like San Francisco, the Bay Area, Seattle, New York, Austin, Texas, things like that. So you won't be seeing it everywhere, but it does exist at these upper echelon of competitive companies. A quick misconception that kind of comes up. People will assume that FANG is the most competitive, but it's actually not true. I would say from least to most, it goes banks, FANG, startups, and quantitative finance. So why are those startups and quantitative finance above? It's because they have fewer positions, the same amount of applicants, and they pay more money. So it's just much harder to pass those interviews. So what are companies looking for? Outside of the interview itself, how do you even get to the interview? I'm not going to go too far into this, but I wanted to touch on it. So the first thing is to apply early and apply often. I have bad news for all of you. The hiring season for summer 2021 for these competitive companies is coming to a close. That's kind of why I did this talk, so I could focus on all that hiring stuff at this point in time. So when I say apply early, I mean like August for the prior year. So people were still finishing their internship in August 2020, and companies were already hiring for 2021. So this catches people off guard every single year. Definitely keep an eye out for that, and there are lots of good resources for finding those job apps. And I think if you go, I'll actually share a link at the end. There's still a lot of open job apps. There are still opportunities if you are interested in that. And then also apply often. You shouldn't just be applying to a few companies and expect to get in. There's a lot of randomness, and these companies are very competitive. So you should be trying to give yourself as many opportunities as you can to find a job. The next thing, this is the most painful thing, is the graduation year. So companies are mainly looking at this point in time for 2022 graduates because they are looking to convert interns into full-time students in the prior year after once they graduated school. So it doesn't make sense for someone to hire me as a 2023 graduate. It's not impossible, but it is a little more difficult. So then on your resume, they're looking for things like, work experience, projects, involvement with campus stuff. But in general, you should understand that every company has a different process, and you shouldn't expect, oh, I got into this company, that means I'll be guaranteed to get into the next company. It's just too random, and every company is looking for something different, and it's just there are no guarantees in hiring, as I've always said. And the last thing that I kind of wanted to touch on is that it's very competitive. As you already know, there's lots of applicants, but they are using means that aren't to filter out candidates that you might not be used to. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is like the prestige of the school you're attending. So there are a lot of people attending from those bigwig schools like like Stanford or MIT and all those smart people, right? But traditionally, when I got into computer science, I was always under the impression that your school that you go to doesn't really matter, and I still kind of agree with that for the majority of companies that I'd be applying to. But for these like more competitive roles, they're looking for more ways to filter out candidates. And I wouldn't say it's to the effect of like, finance or law, where those industries are super dominated by whatever school you attended. Thankfully, we're not that bad, but it does play a factor. And then another thing is your work experience. So companies are kind of like very tight knit. So they're looking for engineers that are already at other, big tech companies. Like, if Facebook is hiring, they're looking for people who worked at Google or Microsoft or things like that. So it's like once you get into one of them, it gets a little easier to get into the others. So it's about breaking into that circle is the hard part. So these are some common data structures that you will probably be using for these questions. I'm not going to go into every single one of them today, but maybe these are some common names or techniques you might have heard of, and this is something you might expect. And then also common algorithms. Again, a lot of names you might have seen before. For greedy algorithms, dynamic programming, and backtracking, these might be new terms to you, but I'll share some good links at the end for learning all of this stuff and reviewing if you need review. So now this part is about how I prepared, and it's a little more narrative. I'm not going to just tell you what I think you should do because there's lots of resources telling you how to prepare. I want to kind of share what my story was and what I learned along the way, because a lot of these things aren't very apparent and they don't really talk about this kind of stuff in the articles, but I think it'll be a little more valuable to you because there will be lots of links on telling you how to prepare. So the quick outline is I started by taking a list of 75 most common questions called the blind 75. And every week I would think, okay, let's try to focus on a subset of them, like a small subset, like maybe 5 or 10 of them. And then I might add a few questions onto that. And then that was my goal for the week. And I did week by week focused on different topics. So I try to be consistent and I try to keep myself to a schedule. And sometimes there would be new topics that I wasn't familiar with. Like when I started on trees and graphs, I couldn't just go into the question head on because there were specific algorithms that I needed to know. And I had to research how the trees and graphs works so that I could have a better understanding. But there was time not just studying questions, but there was also time, learning about algorithms. And it was not just, question after question. And a lot of times what I hear people will do is they will learn all the data structures and all the algorithms ahead of time and then do the LeetCode. I actually did the opposite way, or not really opposite, but I kind of did it sequentially. So I would only try to answer questions for topics that I was familiar with. And then after I felt pretty confident on that topic, I would move to a new topic and then do the research for that topic. And the last thing is I started pretty early. So I didn't start like in June, or I didn't start in July. I knew I'd be doing interviews and assessments in like August and September. So I started in May. So that gave me a lot of breathing room, and it avoided the need to cram. So the quick thing before I get into everything else, this is the most important thing that you need to do before you even touch any kind of question. And I mean this really seriously. This is big O notation, and it's the idea of how you measure the algorithm's efficiency. And if you're not familiar with this concept, that's okay. I will be sharing resources on all this at the end. But if basically, as I mentioned earlier, when you're writing code, there's multiple ways to reach the solution, and not every solution is built equally. Some solutions are better than others, and I'll be talking more on that later. But this is the most important thing you should learn before even touching any question. So I started very small. I started in the middle of May, and I only did string and array questions. I knew about other data structures, but I didn't really have them, fully solidified. So I just focused on what I knew, what I was comfortable with. And I only did the easy level questions. If you've never been on LeetCode, there's easy, there's medium, and then there's hard questions. And I only did easy questions because that's all I was able to do. And I really struggled, but after about these 3 weeks that I went in, I started getting a little bit better, just a tiny bit better, but I could definitely see the improvement coming in. But then I moved on to linked lists, and then that was its own struggle. So basically, every time that I started with a new data structure, there was a new struggle and a new kind of discomfort. But persevering and moving through that was what helped me learn. And that's just kind of a growing pain that you have to get through. That's like a big lesson that I learned along the way. And another thing is, like, if you're given an array or given a linked list or something like that, there are a finite amount of ways to solve the question because there's only so many things you can do, and there's different patterns you will observe. So I can't really talk about that unless it's kind of impossible to teach that. It's something you just have to understand as you're going through the questions. So then I did trees next after I studied linked lists, and I got stuck. I was just stuck in the water. I could not solve a single tree question. And the reason that is because I didn't know two key algorithms known as depth first search and breadth first search. So I had to completely push all the questions to the side and focus on DFS and BFS. And I just really tried to study these algorithms really well. And I came back and I was able to solve these questions because I understood DFS and BFS. If you're not familiar with trees, I would say 95% of the questions that involve trees can be solved with one of these two algorithms. So that was like the key that unlocked the kingdom for me. And then after I learned those, I was able to go back to some medium level string and array questions, and I was able to solve those. If you remember from the previous slide, I said I was only able to solve easies. And what had happened is by learning these algorithms and by trying other kinds of techniques, I had kind of unlocked a better problem solving skill. So by doing something that was kind of separate, solving a different kind of problem, that helped me grow my overall problem solving skills, which is kind of confusing to explain, but once you start studying, you might see what I'm talking about. So at this point, I had solved around 50 questions in a month or so. So then graphs, another struggle. They are similar to trees in some ways, but they are a different beast entirely. And there are a lot of different kind of nuanced graph algorithms that are, some are useful, some are not, but it's kind of, there's a lot to learn when it comes to graphs as well. The next thing is, like, there were a lot of times where after 30 minutes, I was just not getting the question. So I was like, okay, how am I supposed to pop this? And I just looked at the answer. And this might seem kind of counterintuitive. Like you say, oh, if you're looking at the answer, how do you learn? But at some point in time, you just have to realize that you're not making any progress. And that's what you do. So at that point, I was like 6 weeks in and I had gotten through 70 questions, I think. So then from here, I was kind of all alone on this journey. So I joined an online community on Discord. I'll send a link to that later as well. And they're focused on the internship and new grad internship search. So it wasn't just people talking about their jobs. It was people studying for interviews together. And I'm really thankful for that community because there's a lot of smart and helpful people online, and they're willing to help for free. Just show up and you can just kind of. We were working on questions together. Sometimes I would share a question I was stuck with, or someone else would share, and I would help out. And it was a good community where we kind of group studied at times, and everyone benefited. It was really awesome. And then I also reached out to some people. We set up mock interviews. So what would happen is we blocked off 2 hours of time in our schedule, and we said, okay, I'll prepare 2 questions, you prepare 2 questions, and we'll pretend that we are interviewers for a company, and we'll interview the other person. And this helps to not just like, we're not really at this point, we're not practicing interviewing and problem solving skills. We're practicing for interviewing. There's not just, it's interviewing is not just, oh, how good are you at solving the question? It's how can you communicate? How do you what do you do when you're stuck? How do you deal with stress? So how do you work under the pressure of time? And this is helping us to simulate that environment. So that was really crucial for me getting better at not just doing LeetCode, but at actually trying to get through interviews. Yeah, I skipped 2 slides. So the rest, at this point, I was like at 120-ish questions. So I didn't really keep a strict schedule. Like I didn't do the whole 10 questions per week kind of thing. I just kind of, left myself to my own devices. I was still studying a lot. I just didn't say that I was going to do this every week or anything like that. Only use it on a sorted array. And that's not necessarily true. If you look into it more, you'll see what I mean. But that was something I'd overlooked because I thought it was easy. And then there's dynamic programming and backtracking, more advanced concepts, but I was able to do those with a little bit more practice. So then what was my strategy after getting through these 120 questions, right? After a while, I wasn't like, I had kind of generated like a practice strategy, and I didn't like, explicitly think of this. This is just what I was doing kind of subconsciously. So when I see a problem, I'll choose a problem and I'll think of potential solutions for at least 10 minutes without looking at any hints or any extra help. Just me and me focusing on the problems, me versus the problem, kind of just grinding it out, staring it in the face. And then if I'm really stuck after the 10 minutes, there's a hints and a category section for each question, and they might give me some kind of lead as to how to solve the problem. And if I still can't get it after like 30 minutes, there's a discussion page for each question on LeetCode, and you can usually sort by whatever language you want to look for, and you can look at the answer. So I use Python, and I just look for a Python solution, and almost every question has someone who's contributed a solution that you can look at, and that helps me get through it. And the reason why I look at the answer is because if you will just not grow until you need to look at the answer. And then if you feel like you robbed yourself of an opportunity to solve the question, there are similar questions which will apply that same principle that you learned. You can solve those, and then you should also come back and solve the question that you weren't able to solve maybe a week later or a few days later. And it's not enough to just, acknowledge the problem, acknowledge the solution. You should also focus on trying to internalize the solution and understand why it works. So these are some things to keep in mind from overall kind of what I learned. So you should practice consistently and set goals. If you're not going to be doing this consistently, it really won't help you. What I always compare interview prep to like a marathon. If you were prepping for like a week or a month, and then you take a break for 2 months, you won't be in your same state. You'll probably have forgotten everything, to be honest. So you should keep consistent practice and set goals to this every week or something like that, like I did. And then a lot of times what happens is you will have weak points. You won't be as good at this data structure or this algorithm. You should not shy away from them. You should be focusing on them and trying to make them better. You should try to avoid having a blind side. So then another thing is to read as needed, but focus on problem solving rather than reading. So it's easy to like, immerse yourself in all these like online resources and even some textbooks or, the LeetCode discuss page, but you really won't get better until you actually solve the problems. It's really key that you focus on the problem solving, because until then you won't be able to internalize and actually be able to solve the problem on your own. And then this is something that wouldn't be applicable to everyone, but it was for me. And since I gave myself a lot of time to prepare for the interviews, I wasn't preparing for interviews. I was just enjoying the idea of solving the questions. So when I got into programming for the first time, I felt like a satisfaction from, writing some code that works. And I felt that same satisfaction when I was doing interview prep. So I was just focusing on enjoying the process of the algorithms, and I felt the satisfaction of getting it right. And that was what kind of motivated me. And there would even be times where like, I had a little bit of free time. I could either play some games, I could watch something on YouTube, algorithms, and I decided to do interview prep like some kind of crazy person, but I enjoyed it. I genuinely enjoyed it. And it's not something that everyone will be able to do, but you are able to do, and if you are able to do it, then I would suggest trying to do it because it'll make your life a little easier. And then the last thing is that you can do it. So this is a little cheesy, but I've met a few people and they're like, "Hey, Baru, you're a genius. You're so smart. I'm not as smart as you. I can't do it." Like, I was saying the same exact thing to other people who were at the point that I was wanting to be at. And then I got to that point and I was like, "Oh, it's very doable. It's not some black magic. It's not rocket science. It is possible to get better." It's frustrating at the beginning, particularly, and it is always going to be frustrating in general, but you will get better. I can promise you, if you work hard, you will get better. So then now this is like a general frequently asked questions section. And this part is more things that don't fit into any real category, but I wanted to touch on these. So the first thing is, why bother interviewing at these big tech companies? I've talked a lot about what this entails and how you prepare. It seems like a lot of work. So what is the point? The first thing, from me talking to a lot of other people, I asked a lot of other people these same questions. And the first thing that most people will say is money. And the truth is that companies that are in this upper echelon of competitiveness are paying their employees like other companies, unlike any other company. They're paying a lot of money. And it's not even just money. It's like compensation in general. So I met a Facebook intern, and he actually got a bicycle stipend. They paid him $350 to buy a bicycle so that he could be commuting from his apartment to the Facebook headquarters. And I don't think I've ever heard of another company doing that. If you're interested in seeing how much you might make, there's a website called levels.fyi, and they have salaries for interns as well as different salaries at every level of seniority at a tech company for engineers. Definitely check that out if you're interested. And the next thing is like it's a cool company. This is my personal reason, and I really feel that I would be more satisfied with working on a product that I think is cool, like Robinhood or DoorDash or Uber, like a new technology that kind of pushes the boundaries of what's possible. That's what's cool to me, and that's what's exciting to me. The third thing is the resume value. So when regardless of wherever you're going to interview after getting into that company, other companies will acknowledge that, and they will say, okay, well, if this guy got into that company, he must be really good at what he does. Or if she got into Facebook, she must be really good to work at Google. Or even if she wanted to move to like a smaller area, like out in the Midwest, Cincinnati, that woman might be very good to get into any company. You'd have a lot of leverage in that regard. So then the last thing is international students. So I'm not familiar with all the different visa types, but if you are an international student, this might be more appealing to you because these tech companies are more capable and more willing to sponsor international students. So definitely look into that, although I don't have all the information for that. Next question. Why are companies interviewing this way? This is a huge pain. Why do we have to go through all these algorithms? And it's probably not very realistic compared to the actual job. And I would agree with that. But there's two main reasons. The first thing is that it's automatable. So the companies can just send out an online assessment to everyone who applies and just take the top 25% if they really wanted to do that. It just makes their lives easier. And then it's cheap. So Google, before their interview, before they did the technical interview stuff, they actually had 12 interviews for their engineers. You have to get through 12 interviews. And they brought that down to around 4 or 5 with this new process. So they had to take their engineers' time and dedicate it somewhere else, but now the engineers can focus on their job more. That was the idea. What language should I use? Also a very common question. So if you don't have a preference between Python, Java, and C++, I would suggest Python. And the reason I suggest Python is because it is very verbose, it is very easy to read and it helps you to communicate your thought process to your interviewer. And I'll actually go through the code example. I'll be using Python and you'll see what I mean. This is a quote from a Google interviewer. He says that 90% of the people he interviews use Python. So now people will tell me like, I've done so much LeetCode and I haven't improved. Well, there's a misconception with that. It's that if you do a bunch of LeetCode, you will learn. If you think of like a math test, you can do a lot of homework. You can kind of just plug in the numbers into the formula. But are you really learning, or are you just plugging numbers into the formula? So that's kind of how LeetCode is. You need to actually internalize the problem-solving strategies if you really want to improve. The next thing is memorizing questions and answers, and this is something that can be done subconsciously and consciously. And if you're just not able to understand something, you might just accidentally say, okay, well, if I ever get this question, I'll just memorize the solution and I'll just spit the solution back out. This doesn't work because if a company were to give you a slight variation of the question, if you understand how the question works, you should be able to solve it. But if you don't, your house of cards will just crumble and you won't be able to solve the question because you relied on memorizing the solution rather than understanding the intuition. The next thing is not consistently practicing. Again, like I mentioned, if you are spreading your practice too thin, then it will be hard for you to consistently improve. I would say at the very minimum, I mean, of course, everyone has a different schedule. At the very minimum, you want to do at least 5 questions a week, but try to go for more if you can. And then there's also like the lack of fundamental knowledge. If you don't know the particular algorithms or data structures, you probably won't know how to get efficient solutions. And if you don't understand big O notation, algorithm efficiency, then of course it'll be impossible for you to identify what is an inefficient solution and what is an efficient solution. The last point, or second to last point, how much practice until I'm ready? Again, the LeetCode count that you do does not equal how much learning, but you should always expect to fail at some point. I've met some very smart people. They've already interned at Google. They're a very good competitive programmer, and they still fail interviews. Probably not as much as I would, but they still fail because there's randomness, and then you will always have some kind of weak point. So you should go in expecting to fail. It's just impossible to always be prepared. And the next thing is this: everyone learns at their own pace. I mean, not everyone, you might not be the fastest learner, or you might not be as fast as your friend, but that's okay. You will just have to do things at your own pace and maybe do a little more practice or figure out what works for you. But you will succeed if you keep practicing. I'm sure of that. The last point on this FAQ before we get into the question is, how do I deal with failure? And the first thing again is you need to expect to fail, but then from that you should try to figure out what went wrong and target those areas. Did you not know this algorithm? Were you not communicating correctly? That kind of idea. And then you always have another chance. This goes back to what I said at the beginning. And I said you should apply to a lot of companies, and you should apply very early so that you will have lots of interviews lined up. And if you don't get this one, you can have the next one. And if you don't get any of them, you have next year. And there will always be another chance. So now this is a demo time. So I've talked a lot about what it might look like. I'm actually going to go through a real question that you might see in an interview. So this question is called happy number. So I'll read out the prompt really quickly. So basically, you have a given number, and it's happy if you can go through this process. You take the number, you take its digits individually, you square each number, and you sum it together, and that's the new number. And you repeat the process until the number reaches 1, or it loops endlessly in a cycle. So if you reach 1, you should return true, and if you don't reach 1 and you're in a cycle, you return false. So before I even go into how I'm solving the question, there's a few kind of preparation points. The first thing is you want to think about the constraints. So, okay, looks like my highlighting didn't quite work, but if you look closely at this point where it says starting with any positive integer. So usually I'll ask the interviewer, oh, you said integer. Is it possible that decimal points could be in there? Is it possible the fractions could be in there? You want to try to pick away at the question. The interviewer will expect you to ask this kind of thing. But if you're doing an online assessment or just practicing on LeetCode, you want to look for the constraints for the question. So starting with any positive integer is the important point. The next thing are the cases. When I say cases, what directions could the algorithm head? What are the different possible outputs that we could see? Well, it's obvious actually. You return true if the number is happy and false if it's not. What does it mean if a number is not happy? And that means it loops endlessly in a cycle. So theoretically speaking, there could be 3 cases. There could be the number is happy, the number loops in a cycle, or the number does not loop at all and it just goes on forever into whatever direction. But that third case is actually impossible. And how do I know that? Is because the question says this. It says the number equals 1 or it loops endlessly. So I don't have to think about that third possibility because the question itself has told me that. This is important information. And the last thing is you want to break it up. So now that we have those parts, you say that we're gonna have a process in which we need to get the next happy number, and we need to figure out the next numbers somehow, some way. We need to keep iterating, and then we need to do some kind of comparison. So now that I've taken those parts, here's the logic for that. So for getting that next number, we can use modular arithmetic, and I'll show a little bit about what that looks like on the next slide. But we're gonna get each digit one at a time, and then square it, and then sum them together. And then for keeping track of the cycles, well, a cycle means that you've seen the same number before, right? So if it's a cycle, we can store the previous values in a set. And if you're not familiar with the set, it's a data structure. But the advantage is that it is faster to find things in it than an array. It gets a little more complicated, but if you don't understand about time complexity, that's fine. All it's important to know right now is that when we use a set, it's faster to identify if we've already seen a number. And then for finding the answer, we want to have that value that we were given. We want to keep finding the next number. If we've seen it already, if we compare it to the values that are in the set, we know that we have a cycle and we can return false. But if we reach 1, we know that we have found a happy number and we can return true. So this is generally speaking the plan. And this is kind of the pseudocode for that. So this top part up here, it says we're trying to find a happy number. So I'll actually declare a separate happy number function. And how this will work is you have an output. Excuse me, sorry. So you're given an input, and while the input is not equal 0, you want to say that the last digit of the number, you divide that, or to get that last digit of a number, you want to do a modulus 10. So if you have 1, 2, 3, you do mod 10. you get 3. So you get that last digit. And then for the input, you need to not consider that 3 again. So we're going to divide that by doing integer division and cut that 3 off the end. So if you do 1, 2, 3 divided by 10, you get 12. So then you have that digit, and the digit equals 3 in this example. So then you would square that 3, you get 9, and you do that for the entire number, and then you're able to get the next happy number. So then looping towards the answer, you have the set, and you want to keep looping through, finding the next happy number, adding it to the set, and if at any point in time your input is going to be 1, then you can return true. But if you've already seen the same number, we return false. So this is the code. If you compare to the pseudocode on the previous slide, you can see how nicely it translates. That's partially because I'm using Python, but it's also because I've done a lot of effort to try to structure the pseudocode in a way that is easy to understand and translates well into real code. So this looks almost identical to what was on the previous slide, actually. So now the time complexity and the space complexity. So if this goes over your head, that's fine, but I wanted to touch on it. So basically, we can say that there are, if you're given a number like 1, 2, 3, to find out how many digits are in 1, 2, 3, we use logarithm. So then there would be 3 digits, but then we have to consider every number after that. So we have to do log of n plus log of n, so on and so forth. But we are looking for the dominant term in this expression. So we can actually just cut off all the other logs because we know that the first log will be bigger than every log after that. So the time complexity is O times log of n, and the space is O times log of n. And this is because for each iteration, we have to store an extra number in the memory. So if we're thinking of the space and RAM that we're using, we have to store all that numbers in a set. And this will take up O of log n space. Now I'm thinking, is there a more optimal solution? And there is. So this is an algorithm called Floyd cycle finding. So basically the idea is that you will start the rabbit at one spot ahead of the tortoise. And like I'll show right here. So the rabbit is one step ahead of the tortoise. And for each step that the tortoise will take, the rabbit will take 2 steps. And if the path is a cycle, eventually the rabbit and the tortoise will meet once again. But if it's not a cycle, then the rabbit will reach the end, and we know that it's not a cycle. I'll show it one more time just to kind of drive the point home. And this is one of those things that takes a little practice to, identify when you could use that kind of thing. So the new plan follows like this. You're using modular arithmetic, getting the same thing, but for the cycles, we have a slow and a fast value. And to find the answer, we're going to just move the fast value twice and the slow value once and look for that match. And if there's no match and we reach the end, then we have the answer. Here's the pseudocode. It looks almost the same, and it just explains what I went over. And then here's the code again. The slow and fast values, the middle arrow, you can see that slow equals n, fast equals an iteration past n. And then, like you're seeing over here, you're calling happy on slow once, but you're calling happy on fast twice for each iteration. And then we break if we see 1. But I actually made a mistake on purpose. There's one case with this algorithm that will answer that it won't work. And this is called a base case. And the thing is that when you use 1 on this algorithm, it'll actually get you the wrong value until you add this thing at the top. This is called an edge case. And it takes a little practice to identify these issues, but after some experience, you'll start to understand where edge cases might show up frequently. So the new complexity, I'll skip the time complexity because it's practically the same, but there's a proof saying that if we define k, that is the iterations through the cycle, that k will always be smaller than log n, but it's a more complicated proof that I won't get into today. For the space, we don't have to have a set, and we're not adding values into that set. So we have O of 1 space. So this second iteration of the algorithm is superior to the first iteration of the algorithm because we are not using any space. Or I shouldn't say we're not using any space, but for any input for the given algorithm, we are not using additional space. We're not growing. The space of the algorithm does not grow in comparison to the input of the algorithm. And at this point, we have reached the fastest possible runtime with no space used. And this is the best way that we can solve the question. So now that I've shown you guys all that, I wanted to give a quick conclusion. So getting into these competitive companies is not easy, but you can do it if you practice hard. And there's lots of great resources out there. But it really comes down to your effort that you put in. You have to find what works for you, consistently practice, keep on working hard. And then you want to just practice diligently. And there's lots of great resources out there you should take advantage of. And if I haven't scared you off, I wanted to say that you should let me know if you need anything. And I'm saying this because when I was studying for interviews, there were a lot of awesome people, not just like on LeetCode.com in the discussion section, but there were also people that I talked with, people who gave me great advice, people who helped me solve questions. And I don't think I would have got as good as I have been today if it weren't for their help. So it's only fair that I extend the same hand to you guys. So if you want help with a question, or you want to set up a mock interview, or just any general advice, please reach out to me. My email and my name is there. You can connect me on LinkedIn or on Slack. And then there's the big resource list that I was talking about. I'll send a link to this PowerPoint in the chat after this. But with that, I wanted to open up for questions. And that's all I had for today.
Wow, that is so awesome, Baru. Like, that was such a great, it was very organized, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I hope I didn't go too fast, but I wanted to get through a lot today.
Yeah, no, you went really well. Does anyone have questions for Baru? Because I know we covered a lot today.
Just feel free to unmute your mic or put it in the chat or whatever works for you.
Yeah, don't be shy, y'all.
And then for here, these are just examples questions. Like, I know a lot of people, and I've not interviewed at every single company, but they have interviewed at those companies, and they tell me about the process. So generally speaking, I know the process for pretty much any company. So if you had a question on that, or you had like, oh, what's your opinion on this, or how do you prepare for this, anything like that. Nishil said, thanks, Baru. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm glad you showed up. Thanks for tuning in. But anyone have any questions on what I talked about today?
Okay, I'm a little curious. So you said JP Morgan, and where else was it?
General Motors.
And how did those technical interviews go?
So sure. Well, for JP Morgan, I didn't have a technical interview. I did have an assessment, and the assessment was 2 questions, and these questions were straight off of LeetCode.com. Actually, I'd seen both of these questions before, and I was able to breeze through it. A little lucky in that regard, but it worked out in my favor. And then at that point, there was a hackathon called Code for Good, which is their Chase-sponsored hackathon. I went through that 2 weekends ago, and I got the offer last week. So, and then if you decide not to do the hackathon, I think there is like a traditional interview circuit, but I don't know what that looks like. I have not gone through that myself, and most everyone I've talked to chooses to do the hackathon instead. For General Motors, it was actually pretty similar. So I was expecting more technical stuff, but they had like an online assessment, and I'd seen all the questions ahead of time. And I guess it just kind of says that, oh, I've been practicing that much, but I think there's a big factor of luck. There's such a big factor of luck. There have been many assessments and interviews that I failed. I actually failed 2 technical interviews. So I failed one company called Ocient. I failed their final round after getting through the initial round. But then I also had a Microsoft interview a few weeks ago. I thought I did well, but I did not get through. So that hurt. But those interviews I thought went okay. But for General Motors, the final round was just behavioral, but the preliminary online assessment was technical in terms of like algorithms and stuff. But I hope that answers your question.
Yep, that was awesome. Cool. Good to know.
Cool. So I think one person was also unmuted their mic. I wanted to answer that person first.
That was me. I put my question on the chat.
Sure, I'll read Dave's then first. Do you recommend using JavaScript for LeetCode? It does lack quite a few built-in data structures, and its memory cost is a bit high. Okay, so for JavaScript, I think you could get away with it, but there are some companies that will only tell you that you can use this, and usually that's not an issue. Usually JavaScript is acceptable, but it's kind of debatable. And then I would usually just err on the side of safety and go with something that's more accepted, because you never know where you're going to be interviewing. For example, some of those banks and some of those trading companies, those quantitative finance companies, they will not let you use JavaScript because their tech stack relies on C++, Java, and Python. So they will prefer you to interview in that, but usually it doesn't matter too much as long as you choose one of those 3. So I mean, you could get away with it, but I would not recommend it. But it's just hard to say because it depends on where you want to interview, and it's not like it's a bad idea per se, but will kind of hurt you in the long run. And then for those built-in data structures, I'm not familiar with what it has, but if a lot of times like other languages won't have like you won't be expected to build data structures from the ground up or anything. You might just say that, oh, let's just assume that I have a class that's existing in a different file and we're just going to use that file. Like you won't be expected to write the data structures from scratch usually. Not, I can't say that for all the time, but for JavaScript, if you really want to do it, I wouldn't say it's a terrible idea, but if you are open to learning a new language, I would suggest learn Python. It's really easy. It actually kind of reminds me of JavaScript in some ways, but I would really recommend Python I would recommend Python to everyone. Everyone should at least try it for these interviews, but I can understand if you want to use something else. And Piyush said, thanks for the awesome talk, Baru. What would you do if you see something very new in a technical interview that you probably haven't seen that before? Good question. So the thing about it is that there's kind of like this weird phase where it's like you might have an idea for an algorithm, but it's hard to verify that that is the most efficient way to solve the question. For example, like you might have an n-cubed algorithm, and n-cubed traditionally for most questions is a very poor runtime. But for some questions, that is just the only way to solve the question. So it's hard to be like, yeah, this is the best way to do it, or this is even a good way to do it. But usually what I'll do is I'll think, okay, I'll communicate to the interviewer and I'll say that this is what I'm thinking. And then I'll try to gauge their reaction. They'll be like, oh, okay, that sounds like a good idea. Or maybe think of a more faster ways. Usually you kind of lean on the interviewer to help you out a bit. And then if it's like an online assessment, then I would just try to brute force it and, see if it gets you somewhere. But if you do enough practice, a lot of people will categorize questions into like a set amount of patterns. And the thing about these patterns is that a lot of questions are actually similar in some ways. So once you deduce the pattern of the question itself does not become, oh, can you solve the question? It's more of, can you apply the pattern to the question? So at some point, I would actually say that it's hard for that to happen. Like I have seen all the patterns and I have experience with all that. And after that practice, it becomes hard for you to actually not have experience in something. So if you aren't able to identify that pattern, you can kind of lean on your interviewer. But if I just was not able to get the question, I'll usually look it up after the fact and try to prepare myself more, because that's all you can really do to kind of move forward from that point. Kunal says, great talk, loved it. Thank you, and thank you. I'll do my best at the internship. Do you think starting to learn the basic data structures algorithms is necessary before looking into working on interview type problems? If so, do you have any recommendations on how to go about that? So I would say, like I said, during what I did for interview prep was at the beginning, I only focused on string and array questions. I had taken a data structures class, but I wasn't like, super solid on it. I was like pretty good with it. So I just focused on string and arrays. And then once I was comfortable with a little bit of string and array stuff, I moved on to linked lists, and I did the same thing for trees and graphs. And I would say there's other data structures that are fitting into there, but definitely know the one data structure you should know how to use is a hash map and a hash set, which are similar data structures. But they are like, I would say a good 33 to 50% of questions are using a hash map or a hash set in some functionality. They are by far the most useful data structure, and every language has a built-in hashing data structure. So how to learn these things, I will send you some resources. That's on the next slide, or I think that was on the previous slide. There's that link. But to learn them, you can use like the traditional route, which is like there's like a textbook, or your previous notes from class, but what I would recommend, personally what I used, there is a YouTube channel called HackerRank, and they have a playlist of data structure videos, and they just go through every data structure and how it works. And that was super helpful for me learning, because it was just like I already had like the foundation. It was just like a good refresher. But if you want more in-depth and you don't have any experience, there's also MIT OpenCourseWare, and this is lectures from MIT, and it's like from 2005, but of course it's still good quality. And they talk about different data structures, different algorithms. Some of it might be more complex, so focus on the more simple data structures. But there are lots of I really recommend YouTube. There are lots of great YouTube creators who are making awesome videos, not just on like different data structures, but if you just look up a question from LeetCode on YouTube, 85% of the time, I would say, you can find the exact explanation for that question. So a lot of great content out there for solving any kind of question or you're struggling with anything at all. And I will have that link in the next slide. But I hope that answers your guys' questions. Were there any more? Anything else I could answer?
Yeah.
Hey, Joshua.
What's up? I was actually wondering if you think that aspiring to work at a FANG company is like overrated at all.
Overrated?
Or if you have an opinion on that, or if it's just as good as it kind of seems. Because like I know you said you were like fantasizing about working at Google or whatever.
Yeah. Good point. So I think there is kind of like there is a little bit of overratedness. Like I think there is part of some people will think you just drink coffee and play ping pong all day, but it's a job just like any other job. But I will say that it's hard to get what some of these companies have at other locations in the world. So for example, I'm not just like talking about the pay, it's that resume weight. And then they also, I didn't touch on this earlier, but for these unicorn companies, they haven't gone public. They will actually give you part ownership, stock options and shares of the company. And then if the company were to open to the public for trading, the engineers or whoever works there can sell those shares. So this actually happened a few months ago with a company called Snowflake, and they were privately traded, but then they went public. Their stock rose by a lot, and a lot of the engineers that worked there became millionaires and just retired then and there. And I'm not saying this is like, yeah, this is what happens all the time. It's very rare, and obviously it's a lot of luck involved in that kind of situation. But the important thing to remember is that it is a job. You can be like, yeah, I'm gonna push towards a new technology, but maybe you're just centering divs all day. So like it's a job at the end of the day, and you shouldn't think it's any more than that. And it's not like you're any worse for not working at FANG or anything like that. There's lots of great companies in all parts of the world. I just personally, my motivation is that I think it's a unique opportunity, and I think it's something that you can't really find in other places. And that's kind of all there is for it to me. And I think that a lot of people care about the pay, but if you want to do something, like if it all comes down to you, right? It's not a lot of people, it's not worth it. A lot of people, it is worth it to like go through all this BS with the interviewing and stuff. So if you are kind of like on the fence as if you think it's worth it, I would suggest to you at least try it, because you might reap the rewards. And I know I talked about like a big grind, and I've done 230 questions, but anecdotally, one of my friends, he got into Amazon with 30 LeetCode questions solved. And another friend today, actually, this very year, he got into Microsoft with 80 questions solved. And that's like a third of what I've done, right? So I got the same Microsoft interview. I failed it with 230 practice questions, and he got in with 80 practice questions. So, a lot of randomness, but, you can get lucky, and you might find that it's not as much work as you expected, and it might be beneficial for you in the long term. But to say that, the job is superior to other, like you cannot compare jobs, like that's just really toxic mentality. So it all is personal preference. And if it's worth it to you, then I would say at least give it a try. But I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. Great job too today.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I think we're on time, kind of. It's almost 8. So if anyone does have any questions, like Baru's so generous, he put his email here, so it's not hard to reach out. And also, thank you so much for the big link thing. I think 2 slides ago. Like that.
Yeah. I put the actual PowerPoints in the chat. It's on Google Drive. Someone let me know if the link doesn't work, but you should be able to open it and go through the slides, and the big link repo is there. And again, if you want to reach out to me, you can find me on Slack or on LinkedIn. There's my name if you forgot it. And also my email. Just shoot me an email if you want to talk about anything. And I wanted to say thanks again for having me. It was really fun to prepare the talk and deliver it. It was really awesome. Thank you.
Awesome.
Don't leave yet.
Yeah, don't leave it. Don't leave it, y'all.
I'm gonna post the
raffle time?
I'm gonna post the attendance link into the chat. So if you haven't, go ahead and click on that link. It's right there on the screen as well. Log in with whatever. That's how we do the raffle. So we'll give you a couple minutes. Doesn't take that long. We'll do it in a minute here.
Did you guys say you're doing a $20 giveaway?
Yeah. So typically it's dependent on how many participants we get. Is how many giveaways of gift cards we actually do. We have really good participation in this meeting, so I'm probably going to do 3 gift cards. So 3 people will get $20 Amazon gift cards.
I will personally. You can add a 4th. I'll just match it with 1. I can't afford $60, but I can afford $20.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Baru.
Sure.
So while I'm waiting for y'all to fill out the attendance, I'm just going to talk about some things happening around EECS. EECS, if you don't already know, is our acronym for Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. I think Computer Engineering somewhere in there too. But our next ACM meeting will be in 2 Thursdays from now, November 12th at 7 p.m., just like this one. And then ACMW will also be having their meeting November 5th at 7 p.m. I happen to know this is a Let's Chat meeting, so it's going to be more based on personal experiences and sharing in a safe space. So check that out. And then IEEE is also having their meeting the same Thursday that we are at 5 p.m. So they did have their meeting 2 hours before us today, so definitely check them out because they have some interesting topics going on too.
Okay, I'm gonna give everyone another 30 seconds to go ahead and fill out.
You said you just sign in like normally, or?
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so if you already did that, I already got you in, so. Okay, I'm gonna do the thing now. Okay, so it looks like we have, assuming they're all still here, Stanley Huang, and just so everyone knows, just put an email in the chat that you want the gift card to be sent to. Sean DePold, I might have butchered that last name, sorry. Baru, it looks like you won as well.
A net profit of 0.
And I'm gonna butcher this. Rashmi Ravish. I'm gonna assume you know who you are.
Well, thank you, but I'll just not send anything. You guys can handle it.
Yep, that sounds great.
Cool.
Okay, so yeah, definitely make sure you get emails in the chat if your name is called, and we'll email you with the $20 gift card or sometime after.
Yeah. Here,
So,
I'm gonna copy the winners' names and put it in the chat as well.
Yeah, so stick around. Don't leave yet. If you won, make sure we get your email.
Yes.
Cool. So thank you guys for coming so much. Tune in 2 weeks. I think I mentioned our topic earlier tonight, but full stack development with Daniel Loescher is next, or 2 Thursdays from now. So
awesome. It looks like I got all the emails, so thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you guys. Bye.